Million copies internationally when it was published in 1997. Since then, she's put fiction aside to deal with more pressing issues, giving voice to ordinary people squeezed by the march of globalisation. For her views, she's been criticised and even sentenced to jail. But as often happens with people who question the status quo, the more she's been shouted down, the louder her voice has become. She'll be in Australia next month to accept the Sydney Peace Prize. Tonight we speak to her from her home in New Delhi. Please welcome Arundhati Roy. Arundhati, welcome to the show. You say there's a wilderness of mind in India that we have lost. What is it that we don't see in the West that you can see so clearly from India?
The fact that, say, the media or any kind of state institutions haven't managed to completely penetrate the countryside and the underbelly of the city. Because people are so poor, they can't really afford to buy the things that globalization, corporate globalization is pushing at them, including the water and including the electricity. And so what that leaves is a kind of unbarcoded wilderness, you know. So you have a situation like, say, you take the case of a place like Italy, where the Prime Minister sort of controls 90% of the television viewership. He controls the newspapers, many big newspapers. He controls publishing houses as well as bookstore chains. You have a process of indoctrination that people are hardly aware of the fact that they're being indoctrinated. But here, because of the poverty and the anarchy and the, you know, the religious anarchy as well, you just have a situation where even the boot-stamping fascists can't all agree about one thing.
A world without barcodes, that's very dangerous talk, Arundhati, and I would ask you not to repeat that. Thank you very much. When you were young, you grew up in Kerala in the south of India, and to quote you, you were the worst thing you could be, which was thin, black and clever. And you described growing up in a village as a nightmare. Why was that?
Well, because, I mean, that was also partly because I was, you know, my mother was married. She came from a very traditional community called the Syrian Christians, who believed that, you know, they were converted to Christianity when St. Thomas came to Kerala in the 1st century. And they're a very small, closed parochial community. And she then married outside the community. She married a Bengali Hindu, and then worse, divorced him and came back to live in the village, and was just completely unaccepted. And so my brother and I grew up in an atmosphere of, you know, being on the edge of this very parochial community, which was never going to offer us the assurances that it offered, you know, other middle-class children. So in a way, now, obviously, in retrospect, it was great. But at the time, one only dreamt of escape, you know, of leaving somehow and not having to sort of conform to the expectations of those people, and particularly those men.
When you left home at 16, what was in your heart?
The main thing was I needed very desperately to you know, find a foothold which would make me independent, because for a whole lot of reasons I was very terrified and very vulnerable at that age because, you know, of a lot of things. And so when I came to Delhi, the first year in the School of Architecture changed my life, because I suddenly realized that I could, you know, I could survive on my own. I didn't need the people there at all. And it was just such a huge weight off my shoulders. You
did many things over the next 20 years. Architecture, as you said, you were a hippie and goer. You foraged for beer bottles in the rubbish tips of New Delhi. You wrote for television. When the Booker Prize happened in 1997, did your world change completely?
The Booker wasn't the big thing. You know, the thing was when I finished writing The God of Small Things, and when I finished writing it, and suddenly I didn't know what it was, because I'd worked for 5 years, not really, you know, talking about it to anyone. So when I finished it, I didn't know whether it would even be comprehensible to anyone but myself. And when it happened that, you know, suddenly publishers around the world wanted to publish it. And when that book was published, when I saw copies of it, I think that did do something very beautiful and important for me. It wasn't like winning a sporting event, you know, where you just have the pure joy of winning that. It was mixed with so much other stuff. So I don't know. I mean, I'm ambiguous about it still.
One of the things about winning the Booker, of course, is, and all those sales, is suddenly, to use your words, you have money spewing at you. And you decided to give a lot of that away. Now, that probably is a lot harder to do than it is to say. What are the mechanics of actually giving money away?
The fact is that it's a very delicate operation to give money away, because you can also destroy initiative. It's like the World Bank can come in and throw money at some, you know, joint forest management program, not realizing that it's just been siphoned off by the corrupt, you know, the big fish that come to feed at the source. So it's a very, very, very delicate operation, and one that you have to do politically and carefully. The first thing is that I understand that for one person to be rewarded with money in the way that I am, for whatever it is that I've done, whether it's a book or whatever it is, it's somehow a manifestation of there being something very wrong with the world. You can't, you know, nobody deserves to have so much when so many have so little. So the first thing is to see it as a political thing, you know, not as your money, but as something that is there as a political thing, and then see how to use it, you know, carefully and slowly and quietly, without making a song and dance about it. And I have seen it damage, you know, movements and people and initiatives. So you just got to be very careful about it. I think that's the fundamental thing, and also always at the scale of operations in that place, you know. So if you go somewhere and you see that, okay, look, this is a great group of people doing wonderful work, it would be great for them to have a computer, or it would be great if they could just pay their activists a little bit of money every month just to keep, you know, to make ends meet and things like that. So, you know, you can't do it alone. You've got to do it with a group of people, and you have to do it with people who have the same political commitment and understanding. And you have to also understand that to receive for people is as careful a thing as to give.
One of the groups you became very involved with, they were protesting a big dam building project in the Narmada Valley. What was it that drew you to this?
Well, basically what was happening was, here you had a river called the Narmada in central India, and a project called the Narmada Valley Development Program, where they were thinking of building something like 3,500 dams on the river, of which 4 of these dams were going to be mega, huge dams, which would displace between them, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, submerge hundreds of thousands of acres of prime forest in the name of giving irrigation and supplying electricity and water to various, you know, parts of India. And so it was the big question, is this the model of development that is ecologically, economically and politically the right thing to do or not? And the story that emerged is hard for me to just, you know, explain it on TV, but it was absolutely astounding and shocking to me that, you know, in the face of the resistance of people who were being displaced, the least the establishment could have done was to come up with some studies that said, look, here it is, here's what we're saying, you know, but no. Nothing, no figures, no studies, just these empty promises which were broken time after time. Big dams are a way of centralizing resources and siphoning them off.
Even though the battle for the main dam, I think it was called the Sardar Sarovar Dam, was lost, you said this gave you real pride in your people and your land. Why was that?
Well, you know, how do you define a battle that's lost and a battle that's won. It's a very, very complicated thing, because if you come to India and you see the way ordinary people in villages, Adivasi people, Dalits, are terrorized by the state, by the police, by the establishment, and you go into a place like the Narmada Valley where the people have been fighting for their rights for years, even though the dam is being built, even though the uprootment is happening in a completely brutal way with the institutional support of the courts, of the police, of the government, you still see that what has been won is a tremendous spirit among the people. You know, they're not broken, they're just being born in a way. You see all across India now, violent armed struggles are taking over. You know, and this is what I think is a fundamental question raised by the anti-dam resistance, which is not just about dams, but about the notion of non-violence itself. And the onus eventually is on the states. If a state refuses to acknowledge or even be open to being moved by reasoned non-violent resistance, then really it can't claim to be against terrorism, because it's opening the doors to armed struggle in this way. So I think this is a question that lies at the heart of the world today. Very, 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 very important for all of us. You know, I mean, it's not only in India. You know, you obviously are so fully aware of the same thing happening in Australia with the Aboriginal people, the ways in which they're being brutalized and marginalized and really snuffed out. These are questions we must ask ourselves. You know, on which side will we fight? Whether we win or lose is a separate matter. On which side will we fight? On whose side will we fight?
It is, as you say, an ongoing battle, and it certainly was for you personally, as a result of protesting the Supreme Court decision that allowed that large dam to be built. You went through a year-long court case and were eventually found guilty of contempt. You served a day and a night in jail, paid the fine and got out. Did you consider serving the 3-month sentence to make your point?
Just to give you a short background of what that was about. There's a law called the contempt of court law in India. Part of it is just about not carrying out Supreme Court orders, which is fine, but the other section of it has to do with not being allowed to criticize the court or to criticize any judge. This means that even if you had documentary evidence of, say, a judge being corrupt, you cannot bring it to court because it undermines the dignity of the court and therefore it's contempt of court. In which case, in this case, even truth is not a defense. So judges can do anything, but they are above the law in some way. And my point was, how can you have such an undemocratic institution in a democracy? When the people of the Valley came to protest the decision of the Supreme Court outside the gates of the Supreme Court, basically a group of 5 thugs, lawyers, filed a police case against me and a couple of others, saying we had tried to kill them outside the gates of the court in full view of 300 policemen. The policemen didn't accept the FIR, you know, the first information report, because they knew it was a lie. But the Supreme Court of India accepted it and asked me to appear as a criminal, you know, in front of the court. So I did, and I didn't have a lawyer, and I said, look, I think that this is absolutely unacceptable, you know. And of course, that they charged me with further contempt, and then, you know, asked me to apologize, which I wouldn't do. And so they sentenced me after a year-long trial, which was a message to other journalists and writers that if you mess with us, you're going to have to hire criminal lawyers, you're going to have to face a criminal trial, you might lose your job, and, you know, God knows how long you'll be sentenced for.
I don't wish to be critical, but I would point out that they're not just a court, Arundhati, they're a Supreme Court, and maybe you need to show them more respect because they have the word Supreme in front there.
They used to throw my book, you know, from one judge to the other and refer to me as that woman. So I used to refer to myself respectfully as the hooker that won the booker. And then when it came out when the time came, to sentence me, they realized that they were in a bit of a bind because, to put a known writer into prison would be bad publicity, and yet they couldn't really back off. So they started shouting, saying, "But she's not behaving like a reasonable man." So from being the booker, I became not a reasonable man. But anyway.
You're particularly sacrilegious about the Holy Trinity, the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Why don't you believe in them?
Well, they're not sort of religious institutions. And they
I beg your pardon, Arundhati.
So if their whole purpose is to push through unequal, unfair economic trade, then we don't want them. But the point is, it's of course a great thing to have multilateral trade agreements, but not if they're unfair. It's better not to have them if they're going to be unfair. It's better not to have them if what they oversee is America taxing a tailor from Bangladesh 20 times more than a garment made by a tailor in Paris or in London, So the point is that these kinds of inequalities just drive a deep wedge between the rich and the poor in the world, which is why today you have corporations that are richer than most countries. And it's not an accident of fate that this is happening. It's a system that's in place that must be challenged.
When President Bush said, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists," what did you see as your options?
I remember when I wrote my essay called The Algebra of Infinite Justice, and I said this is not a choice that the people of the world have to or ought to be made to make, because we don't have to choose between malevolent Mickey Mouse and the mad mullahs. Today, if you look at the campaign that the Republicans are running in America, they are really saying, if you don't vote for us, there'll be another terrorist attack. And they are creating a situation in which the brutality of what they do can only be matched by the insane brutality of an opposition. And all reasonable people are co-opted. If you look at what is happening in, say, Iraq today under the occupation, they are creating a situation in which the only people who are crazy enough to oppose them are people who normal people wouldn't want to really align themselves with. So by default, you're with us, as in Bush and company. It's a very, very dangerous business. And I think one of the things I keep talking about is the fact that we must break that. We must mount our own resistance. We don't have to support the Mahdi army, but we have to become the Iraqi resistance. We can't just keep quiet and say, we don't like either side and we're just so pristine and wonderful and our principles are all in order, because everything is being usurped while we say that.
How to break that cycle, though, which, as you say, is a vicious one. 10 million people marched around the world to stop the war in Iraq, and it didn't stay the hand of war for even a day. Is Gandhi's non-violence still appropriate, or is a different response now necessary?
The fact that 10 million people marched on February 15th was a wonderful thing. But if we think that by marching on a weekend, we're going to stop a war which is necessary to fuel the machine on which the world works today. It needs that oil. And we can't expect to march on a weekend and expect that, oh my goodness, we marched, we went all of Saturday from 10 to 4 and still the war didn't stop. That's an absurd assumption to make. I think what we do need to do is to understand that nobody can actually, no country, not even the whole of Europe together, can actually match or oppose American military power. But certainly the economic outposts of empire are vulnerable. And I really feel it's important to shut down the corporations that have taken over and raped Iraq and are doing it now. I think this is what activists and resistance movements need to do, to understand that Iraq is engaging the front lines of empire. And we have to, we have to throw our weight behind the resistance.
Your critics would say that you're naive and an appeaser, anti-progress, anti-American. How do you plead?
Well, the anti-American thing is, it's a bit old hat now, because I just come back from America where I spoke at a number of places, and I'm actually in awe of the fact that American dissent is in very good shape. I really admire American people who have been the sternest critics of their own government. I was in New York on the 29th of last month. 500,000 people marched against the Republican convention. If you stood in a place, it took 6 hours for the march to walk past. That was such a phenomenal display. So it's a bit silly, but strategic for them to say, I'm anti-American, But I think, on the other hand, it's important for those of us who come from countries that call themselves democracies, whether it's Australia, whether it's America, England, even India, even though I don't know that India is a democracy, but still it is in ways. But I think that it's important for us to understand that we are responsible for the acts of our governments. If John Howard comes to power in Australia, the people of Australia are responsible for his actions. They are actually confirming and affirming that he took part in the war against Iraq. They are affirming his policies against refugees and aboriginals and everything. So we can't always separate ourselves from our governments in democracies. People in Iraq, people in Afghanistan, I don't think it's fair to hold them responsible for the actions of Saddam Hussein or the Taliban, as the coalition is doing, killing them in their hundreds of thousands. So that, I think, is something we need to think about.
Arundhati, we're just about out of satellite. My last question, which is to do with the rigour of language, and it's your language. You say that a new world is not only possible, it's actually on its way. And on a quiet day, you can hear it breathing. Is the language of hope stronger than the language of fear?
I think where there is fear, where there is fear, there'll always be hope. Where there is oppression, it will always be challenged by those of us who will challenge it with greater intensity. So that's why I don't believe that there can ever be peace without justice. The two go together, and there cannot be peace in the world with full spectrum dominance or nuclear warfare or any of those things. They won't help, because always there will be people who demand dignity, who demand justice, who demand their rights. And that is as much physics as the physics of people who want power and who try to usurp it, is the physics of those of us who will challenge it, and we'll always be around.
In the 60s it was burning draft cards, in the 70s it was burning bras, and it was burning effigies. Now I think you're suggesting burning the barcodes. Arundhati Roy, when you come to Australia, we hope you enjoy your time here. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
That was also partly because I was, my mother was married. She came from a very traditional community called the Syrian Christians, who believed that they were converted to Christianity when St. Thomas came to Kerala in the 1st century. And they're a very small, closed parochial community. And she then married outside the community. She married a Bengali Hindu, and then worse, divorced him and came back to live in the village, and was just completely...
that we have lost. What is it that we don't see in the West that you can see so clearly from India?
The fact that, say, the media or any kind of state institutions haven't managed to completely penetrate the countryside and the underbelly of the city. Because people are so poor, they can't really afford to buy the things that globalization, corporate globalization, is pushing at them, including the water and including the electricity. And so what that leaves is a kind of unbarcoded wilderness, you know. So you have a situation like, say you take the case of a place like Italy, where the prime minister sort of controls 90% of the television viewership. He controls the newspapers, many big newspapers. He controls publishing houses as well as bookstore chains. You have a process of indoctrination that people are hardly aware of the fact that they're being indoctrinated. But here, because of the poverty and the anarchy and the, you know, the religious anarchy as well, you just have a situation where even the boot-stamping fascists can't all agree about one thing.
A world without barcodes, that's very dangerous talk, Arundhati, and I would ask you not to repeat that. Thank you very much. When you were young, you grew up in Kerala in the south of India, and to quote you, you were the worst thing you could be, which was thin, black and clever. And you described growing up in a village as a nightmare. Why was that?
Well, because...
million copies internationally when it was published in 1997. Since then, she's put fiction aside to deal with more pressing issues, giving voice to ordinary people squeezed by the march of globalisation. For her views, she's been criticised and even sentenced to jail. But as often happens with people who question the status quo, the more she's been shouted down, the louder her voice has become. She'll be in Australia next month to accept the Sydney Peace Prize. Tonight we speak to her from her home in New Delhi. Please welcome Arundhati Roy. Arundhati, welcome to the show. You say there's a wilderness of mind in India.